All right, folks, thanks everyone for joining our second episode of Cybersecurity Decoded. We really appreciate you making the time to spend this with us. Just a quick recap, our first inaugural episode, we talked with Wendy Whitmore, the Senior Vice President at Palo Alto Unit 42. Really enjoyed that conversation as Wendy and I got to compare, really similar experiences and compare and contrast those, what we're seeing with the current threat landscape and the operational realities across our different organizations and client sets. I'm equally excited for the second episode for a very different reason. Our guest today is going to have a very different background than the one I'm traditionally used to, which what really made fun with Wendy last time was we could kind of do that. This one I'm excited because I'll just be speaking with someone really from the IT side of the house and really from the very most senior leadership levels. So without further ado, I'll jump in with today's guest, Suzette Kent. She's currently the CEO of Kent Advisory Services, where she guides a wide range of senior leaders across a range of industries to really help them be prepared for being resilient from risk and other topics in this cyber landscape. She's also the former Federal Chief Information Officer of the U.S. government, spent about 2 years in that role. I can't imagine the experiences in that position. And before that, she joined several boards and has deep experience in both the financial and the IT industries going back as far as 1990. So really excited to have you, Suzette. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for asking me to join, Steve. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I am too. Let's just get right into it. There's so many things I'd like to ask you about from your background and your approach. The first is, as we really kind of look at this and just kind of scene set a little bit for how we've looked at things here at Rubrik Zero Labs, we talk a lot about the proliferation of cyber intrusions and how they're tied to the wide range of things across the whole threat landscape and the innovation we're seeing in the industry, how these things all go together. And really, I think it won't surprise you. That's where we spend the majority of our time discussing intrusions, tech, major trends. One of the things we're hearing about more and more, and we talked about it quite a bit in our State of Data Security report, was what are the impacts to us as people, as individuals? And one of the things that really jumped out to me in that, and I'd like to get your perspective on, is that we heard that 96% of individuals we spoke with, and that was about 1,600 people, half of those at that CIO, CISO level, almost universally experienced significant emotional and psychological impacts due to these cyber events that they're working in just the last year. It was things like losing sleep, significant increased stress in their daily role, fear about losing confidence with their peers and their competitors in this space. So one of the biggest things we try to do is really talk to folks about, does what we're hearing and our expectations match your reality? So I'd be really curious, from your experience with IT and security folks, what do you see as the human impact to all of this stuff that we're taking on?
Yeah. Steve, that's a great question. And I think, so many of your listeners are probably, in the space. And from the practitioner standpoint, we've moved from a place where security and IT was a back office function to now it is a leadership level function. It is in everybody's, spotlight. There's a lot of activity in the space. It's a core part of risk management. You have to be, it is a consistent fight. You have to be hyper vigilant. There's always, something going on. So that's a level of intensity that has changed significantly, as well as you noted in the studies that you put out. A lot of the vulnerabilities are known things, but that's a lot of work to continue, right? Addressing those vulnerabilities and patches. And so there's a lot of activity. And then there's still the ever-present unknown that creates kind of a constant level of tenuous stress about what am I going to have to battle? What am I going to have to fight? So, the practitioners are in that world of significant amount of activity, constant level of hypervigilance and the little bit of the fear of the unknown. Leaders have to ask different questions. They have to understand the strategy in a different way. And you mentioned one point in both business leaders and the practitioners in the space, it's still all about, trust and delivering, whether it's a product or a service, well, and, protecting the information of your customers. So that kind of a fear factor and can have an impact if you feel like you aren't making the contribution, that's expected, and that you have a role in the reputational risk of the entity, that you're working with. So it's a significantly heightened, world for professionals in the space today.
I agree with all that. I think so much of this really is about risk and professionals and what we expect leaders to do. If I can dive into the leader part in particular, one thing that has been of interest to me in my career has been, I went military into the intelligence community, into the private sector, and even in the private sector, maintained strong relationships with a number of governments. And it was really kind of the Wild West in the way back days of the early 2000s. You've been doing this longer than I have. You can talk about the Wild West of the 90s. And one of the things that I've personally been a lot of conversations in was, how is the private sector going to help the public sector? That's just kind of been the dominant conversation in my time. You've been on the other side of that. You've been one of the key people asked and tasked to how is the public sector going to help the private sector? So I would love to hear kind of what you think about that and what kind of investments or legislations you think can really help the private sector and address this existential threat that we're running into this coming up year.
That's a good question, and it does, Steve. Yeah, in talking about that time makes it sound like I was not quite there with the dinosaurs, but I have been around a lot of times where security and privacy weren't the first discussion. The point was, how do we create digital services? How do we get people to use those capabilities? Look at this, cool new thing. And it was more about adoption. We didn't necessarily, that was the kind of primary focus. There has been significant amount of progress and understanding, right, as we've come through decades, and particularly as we came through the pandemic, and so many things surged in a digital delivery standpoint. But I think the having spent the majority of my career in the private sector and then going over to the public sector, the public sector has the opportunity to do a couple of things: signal the priorities and establish the guideposts for operations. And because we operate at such a significant scale in the public sector, we also have a place where we can create capabilities that allow our vendor partners and organizations to make those things more scalable. And in today's environment, that's what's really important, is the ability to we have a lot of great solutions, but those need to be consumable across the entire environment. So we have an opportunity to make those approachable and accessible by entities of all sizes, and almost reduce, some of the complexity. You referenced the intelligence community, right? That's a high level of sophistication. But getting those solutions where they fit for everybody is something that we have partnerships to do. We also can be more harsh on the bad actors, and we can share information. I know you and Wendy talked about some of that. We can share, information and address issues and vulnerabilities much more quickly through large scale communication forums and things like that. So we've there's a lot that we are doing better at these days, and there's still more that we can do.
Absolutely. There's a lot you said there that I could just ask you 100 questions on, but there's a couple of things I'd really like to kind of piece together, because I think there's something really particularly profound there that's been top of mind for me probably the last year as a practitioner, as I've kind of grown on my journey. But Wendy Nather over at the Cisco CISO Advisory talks a lot about the cyber poverty line. And that's really stuck with me in my career. You mentioned the sophistication of the intelligence community. That's the world I grew up in. And I expected a lot of the world to work that way. And as you say, it just doesn't. I worked a lot of high-end breaches and a lot of high-end intelligence capabilities, but that's not the reality for most organizations. And you mentioned things that public sector can do, and the word that really jumped out to me was accessibility. So I personally worry a lot about, I think the whole of government approach is necessary. I think it's absolutely critical. I personally believe in that. Rubrik as an entity really believes in that. We support that in a range of ways. But I do have misgivings about those organizations that are below that cyber poverty line. If these organizations which don't have IT teams, they don't have security teams, I'm sure they don't have compliance teams, I'm sure they don't have regulatory teams. How are they going to solve these data risk problems that are really these whole of government solutions? I'd be curious, do you worry about that? Is that something that you think we're off base on? I would love to get your take on that.
Well, see, at first I was smiling because I've spoken to Wendy at multiple points in time, and I agree with her kind of concept there. And what what I think, and I can look back, in my career and talk about kind of like parallel journeys, whether it was, image type of capabilities, whether it was, some of your listeners can easily reflect to mobile phones or things like that. There is a progression. And we actually started building solutions for the spaces that were the most critical. Homeland security, intelligence, global security. Look at the things that we're doing right now, in energy sector, transportation, things like that. Space. So we started with solutions engineered for the highest, most sophisticated user. And now you see, and I get excited by the emergence of solutions that are offered as a service, that are easier to use, that there are lower price points, for on-ramps. And I work with many universities or state and local kind of tribal governments. They don't have a team of thousands. They don't have experts in all the spaces. They don't have a data scientist and, a whole CISO team and those capabilities but they still have the same need. They still have the same purpose to protect, the data, to protect the information of those who they are serving. So what I think we are getting right is pushing for solutions to be easier, to be more accessible, from a price point standpoint, and to have easier entry points. And I get excited by the things that the government does. You can go to CISA's website and there's things that are offered for free. And I get excited by the vendors in the space who make entry points easy and then support organizations during the scaling process. And then, you could talk about workforce, but there are also groups that support the lack of sometimes access to key skills in the market. And all those things are important to make cybersecurity something that everyone can do well.
Suzette, you said something that I'm just going to pull the thread on right away because it's another big topic for us is the workforce. I've referenced that State of Data Security report a couple of times. One of the things that we really engage those senior leaders on is what's the hardest problem you're solving when it comes to securing your organization? Let's just strip it all down. There's bad guys, there's breaches, and there's resources to combat those. And overwhelmingly, the number one thing we heard was an insufficient talent pool, both on the IT side and the security operations side. That's one of the things at Rubrik in particular, we've really tried to take that data point in to the point where you mentioned accessibility and ease of use. We've really tried to re-engineer the usability features to address this. But one of the things I'd be really curious, again, you see the world from a very different optic than I do. Does that finding match your experience? I know you've written on this a bunch. You've spoken on this a lot. I'd be really curious to hear do you think that that's real? And if so, how do we solve as profound a challenge as that?
Yeah. So, it's real. I not to get on a soapbox or anything like that, but I do spend a lot of time in that space. You can look at federal government job openings. You can look at NASCIO, the National Association of the State CIOs, their number one list. You can look at corporate America and the forecast for job shortages. Look at the World Economic Forum forecast for jobs of the future. Guess what you're going to see at the top of the list in all of those, right? Technology, cybersecurity professionals. So it's absolutely real. But the interesting challenge is it's a field that evolves, is moving so quickly. I joked with somebody, if you're listening, have been listening to Everything Everywhere All at Once, that movie, that's how I feel like we have to address the cybersecurity workforce issue. We have to invest in reskilling. We have to have investments that start at K through 12, go through higher ed. We have to endorse certification programs to get people into the profession without, with different types of backgrounds. We have to continue funding education and funding in a meaningful way, not just like one course a year or something, in both federal and corporations. We have to hit on every single cylinder in this space because there's not enough people. And so we need more people, and we need to keep it going because the evolution is so fast. As we've already talked about, the environment, the capabilities move quickly because the threat environment moves very, very quickly. So we got to do everything. And I'm very involved in a lot of those spaces. Not one of them is its own single bullet, but we have to do all of them to create the type of workforce that, again, back to that accessibility point, can address the needs, from intelligence and DoD and Homeland to the business that's across the street in your hometown.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with me personally, having been in both of those spaces, living in small town Illinois while working these, international geopolitical challenges. It's fascinating to see how it all comes together. Okay, one last question. I could ask you a million. I want to be real cognizant of your time. We get the opportunity to talk about the long view, which is one of the things I love about this series. It's kind of nice being the person with the microphone. I get to ask the questions that I'm fascinated in, and I'm so intrigued by the long view of all of this because we spend so much time on the event from last week, the net new O Day. I mean, that's just where the attention goes, which is natural. But one of the things I'm curious your perspective on is as I look back on my short, long career in this industry, I'm more of a cautious optimist. There's a lot of things that I've been doing this long enough to be wrong. There's things that if I was on record saying there's no way this will ever happen. There's no way we'll do that. And they're being done. Do I think we've solved all these challenges? Absolutely not. I think you said it really well. This landscape's moving very fast. The needs, the threat, all of it. But I am cautiously optimistic. It's very easy to be a pessimist. I'm that on most days. But when I take a step back and look at the last 20, 25 years, it does give me reason for optimism. So I'll kind of wrap this session with that last question to you. Are you more of an optimist or a pessimist when you look at the long view?
Well, I'm always an optimist, but I'll tell you why I'm an optimist in this space. And I thought it was interesting. I saw a report out from Davos this week where somebody said, kind of being pessimistic. Here's why I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist if we continue to make the right workforce investments. And I know we can. And I see those happening in so many spaces. And I'm an optimist because I think the capabilities they are coming to market. We do have to pull them down market. And I'm an optimist because this is a profession almost, I'll compare it to being an athlete, right? It is your training and you're continuing to move forward. And to your point, when you think, oh, we can't do that, I haven't seen that before, someone accomplishes it. And having watched the evolution over so many years, I am confident that we'll always find a way to solve the challenge. Where we have to continue to spend time and resources, and in some cases, public sector legislation, is making sure that those solutions cover the entire population. So they're not just for the companies and the organizations that can afford it, that we share, that knowledge and the way that we solve those problems with as many as quickly as we can.
Suzette, I think that it's incredible. I'm not going to run the risk of messing up probably the best way to end this episode, which is with that amazing answer from you. So I'm going to call it there. And I just want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for your time. And really the big thank you for your advocacy and your work in this space over, the long term. It's been really neat to talk about with you today.
Thank you, Steve. It was a fun conversation.